All right, so I am officially recording if anybody's keeping track. Does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff we went over last time? Class stuff, lab stuff, anything? A reminder that next week we have no in-person labs. Your lab assignment for next week, either Tuesday or Thursday, depending on which lab you're in, is going to be to do the QC assignment that I handed out last time, or I gave to you today. There's 3 videos to watch and a bunch of assignments that you have to do. And those assignments are due when you walk into class. They're due on paper, not in Canvas. They're due on paper when you walk into class Monday, March 23rd. So not next Monday, Monday after. So again, there's no in-person lab next week. Okay. Hopefully that covers everything. Hopefully everybody, if you wanted it, the lecture was posted. I did update the PowerPoint that I posted for you to include the objectives, because for whatever reason they were not on that PowerPoint. Hopefully it is fixed now. Yeah.
I need an error every time I try to load the PowerPoint on Canvas. I was able to download it, but just like through Canvas, it's not
Is it like that for everybody? When you try to open it in Canvas, there's like an error?
Well, I opened it like 20 minutes ago, printed it, and it was fine, but it's telling me error now.
Accessibility is incredibly important, but it makes it so like none of my stuff works. So I guess what I'm gonna maybe try to do, I don't know. I'll look into it. I'll see what I can do.
because like downloading it has like the objectives.
Yeah.
It has like the
I wonder if it's something because I updated it and that's why it's not working. For some reason, this file, like I did my whole other class, I had like 10 different PowerPoints. And they were all perfectly fine. And even chapter 8 for this class was perfectly fine. But for whatever reason, it does not like this chapter 7 one. So check the chapter 8 one. If that's doing the same thing, then I'm just going to have to figure something else out. I don't know. Because I'm having to upload them as PowerPoints now. I used to upload them. Chapter 8 works. It just does not like this file. So chapter 7, you're just going to have to download. I'm sorry to tell you. Yeah, I don't know why it doesn't. I've emailed it to IT. It's a whole thing. I used to upload all my stuff as PDFs, but that's not allowed anymore because readers can't read them. So I have to do everything as PowerPoint. It's just not as convenient, unfortunately. But I will try my best to figure it out. Anything else before we get started? Okay, so we are picking up right where we left off, talking about hormone regulation, specifically of carbohydrates. And I'm going to go over this slide again. We kind of rushed at the end last time, so we'll cover it a little bit more. When it comes to glucose levels in the blood, remember that in a human body, when it comes to a human body, it's really important for the human body to keep glucose levels and any other levels within a very narrow range. That is going to be a common theme throughout this whole class, is how your body maintains whatever it is that we're talking about within the range that it needs to be. Now, in human bodies, it's very, very normal for glucose levels to rise and fall throughout the day, specifically when you eat. After you eat, your blood glucose levels will go up, and then your body's job is to bring those blood glucose levels back down within normal range. And if it's been a while since you've eaten and those glucose levels are dropping below what we would consider a normal range, you will have hormones that will bring it back up. And that is all through the processes of the ones we talked about last time: glycolysis, glycogenesis, glycogenolysis, lipogenesis, and lipolysis. Try to be on time, guys. I'm going to count you here as today as here, but if you're late again, I'm not going to count you as here. Everybody got it? Okay. Okay, so this is how your body maintains your blood glucose levels within that very narrow range. And I'm going to write this one down. I have it on a slide later, but the blood glucose range within a typical human, a normal range, is usually between 70 not 700, 70 and 100 micrograms per milliliter. Between 70 and 100. That is considered normal in most adult humans. So if our blood level goes above 100, our body is going to do what it has to bring it back down. If it goes below 70, our body is going to do what it has to do to bring it up. Now again, I want to stress that your blood level going above 70 or above 100 or below 70 temporarily is perfectly normal. It is what is supposed to happen within your body. Okay, you eat food, your blood levels go up. You haven't eaten in a couple of hours, which is very typical of a human being, your blood levels are going to drop, and your hormones are going to regulate that. So hormone regulation is not an abnormal process. Your blood levels are supposed to spike, and your blood levels are supposed to go down. But there is a normal range in which they are supposed to go up and which they are supposed to go down. And we'll talk more about that when we get to diabetes in just a few minutes. Yeah.
This is the commonly referred to fasting glucose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, when
Yeah.
you haven't eaten.
We'll talk more about like the details of it later, but yes, it is a fasting glucose. Okay, so our two major hormones in blood glucose regulation are going to be insulin and glucagon. Okay, these are our two major ones. We're going to talk about a few more on the next slide, but our two big ones are insulin and glucagon. And insulin and glucagon are what we call counteracting hormones, which means that they work opposite each other. And when insulin is released, glucagon is not. When glucagon is released, insulin is not. Okay, so they act opposite each other to achieve opposite effects. Okay, and again, insulin's job is to decrease the overall level of blood glucose. So kind of on the bottom here, these are opposite. When you have high glucose, meaning you just ate food. I just ate my breakfast about 30 minutes ago. So my blood glucose levels are higher than probably 100. Okay, because I'm not fasting. I have eaten food. So my blood glucose levels are high. What my body is going to do now is those beta cells within the pancreas are going to secrete insulin. That is going to promote all of the processes that decrease the amount of glucose in the blood. The ones that are on this chart pointing away from the center. So if this is the blood, this is blood glucose, we'll say. All of the processes pointing away, taking that blood glucose out of the blood, turning it into energy, turning it into glycogen, turning it into fat tissue, turning it into proteins. All four things that point away from the blood glucose. Okay? And the end result of that is going to be a decrease in blood glucose. Okay? Hopefully back within that nice normal range. Now, in a few hours, I teach this class and then I teach another class right after it. I'm not going to be eating again until probably about 1 o'clock. So I ate at about 8, which was not 30 minutes ago, but I ate at about 8, and I'm not going to eat again until about 1. So in a couple of hours, my blood glucose levels are actually going to start to drop. My body will have run through all of the energy that it created from my breakfast, and it is going to start to drop below 70. And in that case, what will happen is the pancreas alpha cells are going to secrete the opposite hormone, glucagon. And all of that hormone, glucagon, is going to support all of the processes that point in to the blood glucose. So glycogenolysis, it's going to break down glycogen, it's going to break down fat tissue, and if it's absolutely necessary, it'll start to break down proteins and amino acids. Yep.
What about during exercise when your body's expecting to need more energy? Will it spike glucagon as well?
Glucagon?
Yeah, glucagon.
It will, because your blood glucose is going to start to drop.
Okay.
But exercise is really complicated, so something that, for right now, we're going to try to think about these in terms of one thing and two things and kind of keep them isolated. In reality, and we'll get more into this later, hormones are very rarely dichotomous like that. There are many, many hormones that are released at different times that do the same thing, and they interact with each other. But yes, your body, if you are using all of your energy at a much faster rate, your body will start secreting glucagon. Okay, so those are the two major hormones of blood glucose regulation, insulin and glucagon. Now the next slide is going to show you some other ones. They're kind of lesser ones, and all of these we're going to kind of talk about as we go through the rest of the class, because we are going to talk about these hormones when we get to their own systems. But I want to bring it in now so you can kind of see, again, this is very rarely a black and white thing. There's very rarely one thing that acts one way and one thing that acts another, and there's nothing that changes that. Okay, everything is interconnected. That's why when you have a hormone problem, everything in your body is screwed up. There's a reason that menopause is one of the most horrific things that people go through, and it's because your hormones are so out of whack that everything in your body changes. Okay, so hormone regulation, this is kind of a second slide of hormone regulation. Now, here I have these hormones broken into two categories. They are hypoglycemic agents. So hypo, as a prefix, hypo means low. Hypo always means a decrease or lowering of whatever we're talking about. So hypoglycemic, glycemic has to do with blood sugar levels. So hypoglycemic means decreasing blood glucose. So a hypoglycemic agent is going to decrease blood glucose, which again we talked about on the other slide. Insulin is our primary hypoglycemic agent. Its major job is to decrease blood glucose levels. Okay, and you have it, there's another chart up here that says all the same stuff I said on the other slide. It's just in a chart, if that makes it easier for you. Okay, now something I do want you to notice is that under hypoglycemic agents, there is one thing listed, and it is insulin. There is not really another hormone whose job is to decrease blood glucose levels. Insulin is kind of it, which is why when you don't have insulin, like we'll talk about in a few minutes, it's incredibly devastating because there isn't really a backup. Okay, so hypoglycemic agents, insulin is going to be our only gal here. Okay, now hyperglycemic is exactly the opposite. Hyper means high, hyper, high. I know hypo also starts with high, but hypo rhymes with low. Hypo is low. Hyper is high. Like when somebody has hyperactivity, or they're hyper, right? It means high activity. Hyper is always going to mean up, or excess, or lots of. So hyperglycemic agents are agents that their major job is to increase blood glucose. And these are going to be things like glucagon. Okay, we talked about glucagon on the last slide. This is our major one. So when we're talking about increasing blood glucose, glucagon is going to be our big one. But we have a lot of other ones that I put here. Like I said, we're going to talk about all of these in their own time. When we talk about the endocrine system, we're going to talk about epinephrine and cortisol and ACTH. This will come up again. However, I want you to think about, remember that glucose is energy. When your body needs energy, it needs glucose. That's kind of simplifying, but it holds true most of the time. So epinephrine, most of you know what epinephrine is. What is epinephrine? Adrenaline, right? Most of you heard that. It's adrenaline. It's what happens, you have a surge of epinephrine when you're doing things like exercising or when you're running away from something, if you're scared, if you have anxiety. Okay, so if you are, think about what happens when you're really, really scared. What is your body's immediate response to being absolutely terrified? You run into something that's really scary. What do?
Run away.
Run away. It's the fight or flight response, right? That fight or flight. Your body is going to try to do something, whether that means fight or run away. It's your instinct. When you're scared, your heart rate goes up. You start shaking. Your blood gets pumping much, much faster. If you were going to fight, or run away, what are you going to need to do it? Energy. You need energy to run away. So an increase in epinephrine, cortisol is another stress hormone. Again, we'll talk about all of these. When you're growing, growth hormone is responsible for growing. What does anything need to grow? Energy. So all of these are controlled by processes that require energy. So when you are stressed or scared or exercising or growing, you're going to need energy. So these are secondary hormones that will also increase blood glucose. And again, we're going to talk about a lot of these later. But this is, again, why it can be so difficult when you have any kind of hormone dysregulation. If you're a person that has pituitary tumors or something like that, and your hormones are out of whack, if you have, a growth hormone tumor that secretes too much growth hormone, that can mess with your blood glucose levels because you're producing too much of a particular hormone. And so a lot of these interact with each other and kind of overlap. But again, our two major ones are going to be insulin and glucagon. All right. Now, again, I wanted to mention that these are counteracting hormones, specifically this insulin and glucagon. I wrote over here, they're counteracting. That means that when your body is secreting insulin, so if there's ever a time when your body has high blood glucose and you're secreting insulin, your body is actively going to counteract or stop the release of glucagon. Because glucagon does exactly the opposite of what we want it to do. And the same is true for glucagon. If your body is releasing glucagon, it is going to actively stop the release of insulin. They counteract each other. They're opposite. And that's going to become really important in just a minute when we're talking about diabetes. Yep.
What the secondary hormones do we have to know?
What did you say? Sorry.
For the secondary hormones, do we have to know what plant they're from? Or is it just...
No, it's just the kind of, we're going to talk about these later. So like this stuff, you don't have to know about this stuff right now. You will have to know about it later. Okay? Like where it comes from, things like that. That's all you really have to know about it is what I kind of said for now. Don't worry too much about what's in the chart. Just know that these other ones are energy requiring processes, and so they increase blood glucose similar to glucagon. They act similar to glucagon. But yeah, we will get to all of those, and you will have to know all of that when we get to the endocrine system, but not today. Okay? So before we talk about diseases affecting blood glucose levels, I want to talk a little bit about insulin. Specifically, the difference between endogenous and exogenous. So endogenous, again, these prefixes and suffixes and base words, if you've taken medical terminology or anatomy and physiology, these words are going to be really important. They're going to help you understand what's going on. So endo, as a prefix, is always going to mean from the inside, or something coming in, or being released from inside, or being produced inside. So endogenous is something produced inside of our body, something our body produces all on its own. Exo, like an exoskeleton, right? An exoskeleton is something that is always going to be on the outside. So exogenous is something that our body does not produce, but we take from the outside. So specifically talking about insulin, insulin is a hormone that our body produces. When our body produces insulin, it's called endogenous insulin. Insulin is also a medicine that you can take. It is a hormone that is produced and you can take as an injection. When you take it as an injection, it is called exogenous insulin. Now, this specifically becomes important when we talk about diabetes in just a minute. But there is a difference between endogenous and exogenous insulin. endogenous insulin, when it is produced inside of our bodies actually produce something called proinsulin first. And proinsulin is a precursor. It means it's the first thing our body produces, and it sits inside of our body in kind of an inactive form. Okay. Our body produces this. It sits in our pancreas in this inactive proinsulin form. And it can sit there for as long as we need it to. But when we need insulin, our body is ready. It has like a stockpile. This is how our body stockpiles the insulin that it makes. And this proinsulin has 3 pieces. It has an A chain, a B chain, and a C chain. Okay? However, when insulin becomes active within the body, that's what this is, real insulin or active insulin basically has this C chain cut out. So there's 2 cuts made, and that's what makes it active. It cuts out that C chain of the protein, it alters the shape a little bit, and then that insulin becomes active. So the removal of that C peptide is what makes the insulin active. So when your body endogenous insulin, active insulin is produced, you will have insulin, which is the A and B peptide together, that's insulin. But you will also have as a byproduct this C peptide that it will be floating around in your bloodstream because your body had to get rid of that to make the insulin active. So endogenous insulin, you will have C peptide that goes along with it. Exogenous insulin, there is no proinsulin. Exogenous insulin, when it is created in a lab and produced as medicine, is created as only the A and the B chain. So exogenous insulin will have no C peptide. Now that becomes important when people are taking insulin because of a disease that they have. Okay, so these little questions down here. If a patient has an incredibly high insulin level, you test their blood, and their insulin levels are well above normal, incredibly, incredibly, incredibly high. But their C peptide is normal. Is the source of the extra insulin exogenous or endogenous?
Exogenous.
Exogenous, because they took a bunch of extra insulin without the C peptide. Okay. And again, we'll talk more about this in just a minute, but injection of too much insulin is a leading cause of death. Okay, it's a very common thing that happens in people that use insulin for disease management. And so testing a person for insulin levels and C peptide levels can be really important to discover what's going on in their bodies. So if a patient has a high insulin level and a high C peptide, is it endogenous or exogenous? Endogenous. Yep. Because their body is producing too much insulin with too much C peptide. So you know that that is something that is happening inside the body. If that is happening, they probably have an insulin-producing tumor, which again, we'll talk about in just a minute. But the C peptide is a really key component in testing, which is what all of this is about. Remember again that this class is for MLS majors. They're learning how to interpret test results. So we have to learn the background first, but it's learning how to interpret these test results. All right, so now we're going to talk about clinical significance as it relates to blood glucose levels. We're going to talk about a series of different diseases. And the major disease associated with blood glucose levels is going to be diabetes mellitus. Now, diabetes mellitus is actually a group of diseases that are all characterized by hyperglycemia. Is hyperglycemia too high or too low?
Too high.
Too high. Hyperglycemia means you have too much sugar. Okay, so this group of diseases is characterized by high blood sugar or hyperglycemia, due to various defects, and we're going to talk about each defect in turn. A defect in insulin production, insulin action, or both. And diabetes mellitus as a category, again, as a group, is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States. It's an incredibly significant cause of death. It's an incredibly significant cause of disease. There are a lot of people, I think I have these numbers written down. It is estimated that 29 million people in the United States, almost 10% of the total population, have some form of diabetes. 10%, that's a lot. So 30 million, almost 30 million people in the US have some form of diabetes. And it is a primary cause, that's supposed to say cause, primary cause of blindness and renal disease or kidney disease. We'll talk about why that's true. For a lot of people, that's really weird, why blood sugar would cause blindness and kidney disease, but we'll talk about why that's true as we go through. And there are 4 major categories of diabetes mellitus, or DM: type 1, type 2, gestational, and then secondary. We'll talk about all of them. Okay. So this is type 1 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes accounts for 5 to 10% of total diabetes mellitus cases. So not very many if we're talking about all of the DM cases in the entirety of the United States and the world, about 5 to 10% of them are type 1. However, it is the most commonly diagnosed type of diabetes in children. So if a person has diabetes diagnosed as a child, it is most likely type 1 diabetes. All right. Now, type 1 diabetes mellitus is an autoimmune disease. And what an autoimmune disease is in general, if you don't know, an autoimmune disease, again, that prefix auto is going to mean self. So an autoimmune disease is basically when your own immune system attacks something in your body. And there's lots of different types of autoimmune diseases, things like lupus, celiac disease, Crohn's disease, and all sort of colitis. There's lots and lots of different autoimmune diseases. And diabetes mellitus type 1 is an autoimmune disease. And what basically happens in type 1 diabetes is that immune cells, so antibodies and T cells, within your own body as part of your own immune system, go haywire and destroy the beta cells in the pancreas, the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. Okay, so a normal functioning pancreas, you have these beta cells that produce and store and release insulin. Remember, the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans are insulin. Alpha cells are glucagon. So this is a normal pancreas where we have happy little beta cells that are producing insulin. In type 1 diabetes, T cells, which again are your immune system cells, they are white blood cells that are supposed to attack foreign invaders, bacteria and viruses and things like that. But in the case of type 1 diabetes, those T cells have a miscalculation somewhere and they destroy the beta cells, resulting in little to no insulin release. Most people who have type 1 diabetes at some point in their life release 0 insulin. So the overall end result of type 1 diabetes is something called insulinopenia. This is another one of those suffixes. Penia is always going to mean a decrease or absence. So insulinopenia means a decrease or absence of insulin. Okay. So in type 1 diabetes, there is an absolute deficiency of insulin. There is none. There is none for the body to respond to. Type 1 diabetes is also known as insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, or IDDM, because this disease can be controlled and treated with the injection of exogenous insulin. It's insulin dependent. Okay. And again, remember that if there is no insulin to be had within a body, blood glucose levels will continue to go up. Okay, those blood glucose levels will go up and up and up and up and up. It's not abnormal for somebody with untreated type 1 diabetes mellitus for their blood glucose levels to be 800, 900, 1,000. It's going to start to cause very serious issues above like 150. But in untreated diabetes, those blood glucose levels keep going up. Remember that we talked about the only hypoglycemic agent within a human body is insulin. If it's not there, your body has no way of getting rid of all that extra sugar. Not only that, but if your body cannot take the glucose out of your blood and to use it to turn it into energy and things like that, your body is not going to be able to utilize that glucose. Okay, you have to have insulin in order to be able to use that glucose. So people with type 1 diabetes, if they are not taking insulin, they will eventually basically starve no matter how much they're eating because their body cannot use the food that it's being provided. And the symptoms, the most common symptoms at onset, so as this is developing, are the 3 Ps, call them polydipsia, polyuria, and polyphagia, which is poly always means many or increased. Polydipsia, polyuria, polyphagia, excessive thirst, excessive urination, and increased appetite. The polyphagia, the increased appetite, should make sense because this person is basically starving. Even though they're eating, their body cannot use the glucose that it is eating. It cannot use the energy that's inside of the body because the insulin is not there. So they're continuously hungry because their body cannot use the food that it is eating. So they'll be continuously hungry. And then the excessive thirst actually comes from, we're going to talk about this later. Again, I know I keep saying that, but hopefully you've heard of something called osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure is basically when something becomes too concentrated. Okay? It has to do with the amount of solutes in a solution and all kinds of stuff that hopefully you've talked about in chemistry before. But if you haven't, we'll talk about it later. But basically what your body is trying to do is you have too much stuff in your blood. The blood glucose, there's too much of it. It's floating around in your bloodstream and it's screwing everything up. So the point of the excessive thirst is to basically dilute all of that glucose. It's like trying to dilute ocean water, right? It's too concentrated. There's too much glucose. And so your body has these signals to drink more water to try to dilute out the glucose. And then the excessive urination is linked to the excessive thirst. If you're drinking gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons of water every day, you're going to be peeing out gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons of urine. And then some of the other symptoms will be things like rapid weight loss, again, because this person is basically starving to death, even though they are eating. Blurred vision, mental confusion, because, again, if your body does not have energy, your brain is not going to work. Your muscles are not going to work. Everything in your body is not going to work or function. And then dehydration as well, because of the excessive urination. Basically the patient is in a semi-starved state because the glucose cannot be removed from the blood and used as a food source. If untreated, type 1 diabetes mellitus will eventually lead to a coma and death. That much glucose, again, the person is starving. The glucose in their blood cannot be taken into the cells and used. So eventually a person will go into a coma. Most of the time when type 1 diabetes is, and this is a really scary thing, but remember that these things can be treated now. But most kids who are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, they're diagnosed, the first symptoms that their parents really notice is that they go to bed for a nap and they don't wake up because they're in a coma. Their blood sugars are through the roof and they're in a coma. because I don't know how many of you have ever had a toddler or a kid, but like, I mean, they're peeing into a diaper. I'm not gonna know. Like, I'm changing 2 extra diapers a day. I don't know. When you have a toddler running around, it can be really hard to tell. And especially in like toddlers, like, are you really tracking their water intake? These signs, like if I suddenly started drinking extra gallons of water a day, that I would notice that in myself, right? I would think that was weird. But in a toddler or a little kid, those kinds of things can be really hard to pick up on. They're very subtle. Increased appetite, kids, I mean, my son has always eaten like a maniac. And so if he suddenly had an increased appetite, I'd think that he was going through a growth spurt, right? He's 8. Of course he's going through a growth spurt. They always are. And so those signs can be really subtle, but your kid not waking up from a nap is not a subtle sign. And a lot of times that is how children get diagnosed, because their parents try to go wake them up from a nap and they won't wake up. Okay. So diabetic ketoacidosis is the specific type of coma that happens in people with diabetes, specifically type 1 diabetes. And we'll talk about why. In diabetic ketoacidosis, remember that we talked about that insulin and glucagon are opposites. They are counteracting hormones. When you have low amounts of insulin, you're going to have high amounts of glucagon. When you have low amounts of glucagon, you'll have high amounts of insulin in a normal person, typical person, healthy, functioning pancreas person, not a normal person. That's not a nice word. So in a person with diabetes, they have a severe decrease, if not zero insulin in their body. Because glucagon is their counteracting hormone, and remember that the type 1 diabetes only destroys the beta cells. They're specific to the beta cells. That means that the body will continuously produce large amounts of glucagon because there's no insulin. The signal to shut off the production of glucagon is insulin. If you don't have any, the glucagon is just going to keep getting released. And you have high blood sugar. That is another signal for glucagon to be released, or insulin to be released, but it's not. So your body will continuously produce glucagon. Glucagon, remember, leads to all of those things. Glucagon's main job is to increase blood sugar. It is going to do all of those processes that increase gluconeogenesis, lipolysis, glycogenolysis, which all further increase blood glucose levels. So those blood glucose levels are going to continuously go up and up and up and up. The insulin will never be produced because it's not there. And so that blood glucose is just going to go up. And there's not going to be any way for the body to counteract that. The glucose cannot be utilized. So all of the fat and muscles are eventually going to start to break down. And that process leads to the buildup of ketones. That's why this is called diabetic ketoacidosis. Ketones are acidic substances. And those ketones are the result of the breakdown of fat, but mostly muscle and protein. And if this is happening in a small amount, it's not that big of a deal. But if it continuously happens over days and days and days and days, and this person does not have any food source, because try to think about what's happening in the body. This body is starving. It does not have food. What happens in a body if it does not have food? If I just stopped eating, even though I have insulin, if I stopped eating in a couple of days, what will start to happen is my body will break down all the fat first, and then after that, it's going to break down the muscle and your brain eventually. It'll break down your organs. Your body will do whatever it has to do to provide energy for it. So this person is continuously starving for days and weeks and weeks and weeks. Eventually, all of their muscles are going to start to get broken down. And the breakdown of muscle leads to the buildup of ketones. Ketones are acidic. Blood is not supposed to be acidic. Ketones are bad for the blood. And so this causes the buildup of ketones, causes the coma. The acidic blood, we're going to talk about blood gas levels and blood acidity and blood alkalinity in a couple chapters, but acidic blood is not a good thing. So eventually the increase of glucagon, the breakdown of muscles, the breakdown of fat, the buildup of ketones is going to lead to acidic blood, which will cause a coma. And eventually, if this is not treated, it will cause the person to die because they have no food. Now, diabetic ketoacidosis is much more likely in type 1 or insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus because of the absolute lack of insulin, because there is so little insulin that the amount of glucagon is continuously going to go up, which is going to break down the fats and the muscles, which leads to ketones. This doesn't typically happen in people with type 2 diabetes, which we'll talk more about in a second. Make sure I said everything I wanted to. Yep. So again, this usually only happens in type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, it can happen. And there's also, again, I'm sure somebody has told you this before, but in science and biology and human health and all of these things, there are very few absolutes, and there are very few things that are black and white, and very few things that can be categorized just as this, and it's always like this, right? Most things have exceptions, and we've discovered, now we're going to talk about type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes as separate things, but it's also really important for you to realize that it's not always like that. There are people that have type 2 diabetes that kind of looks like type 1. I think that there's actually a categorized type 1.5 now. And I think there's like a type 3, which is not talked about before. I think there's a 2.5. I think there's all kinds of different weird variants because human bodies are weird. And one of the things I always say is that bacteria, organisms, human bodies don't read textbooks. Okay, they don't always fall into exactly the way that they're supposed to be. So when we talk about it in this class, we're going to talk about it as distinct things, but it's important for you to realize that that's just kind of a simplification for the purpose of this class, and that it is not always that simple. If you ever go to med school, they'll teach you all the really complicated stuff. But for now, we're talking about the simplified versions. And in the simplified versions, diabetic ketoacidosis really only happens with type 1 diabetes. And like I said, most children who are diagnosed with insulin-dependent diabetes or type 1 diabetes are diagnosed because they go into diabetic ketoacidosis and they go into a coma and they don't wake up from when they go to sleep. And their parents take them to the emergency room and their blood glucose levels will be like 800 or 900. Now, the good thing about all of this, and the reason that we talk about stuff like this, is because type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes and gestational diabetes can all be managed and treated. There was a time when that wasn't true. Okay, type 1 diabetes wasn't treatable until, probably less than 200 years ago, maybe 120 years. I don't know the exact numbers, but maybe like 120 years ago. The production of insulin as a medicine was not possible a couple hundred years ago. And so for a long time, it wasn't understood what happened in type 1 diabetes, but it was relatively common for children to go to bed and never wake up and die from a coma. And nobody ever knew what was wrong with them, and nobody knew how to fix it. But in today's world, we can fix it. There are a lot of ways to manage type 1 diabetes. It's a long struggle that lasts their entire lives. But a lot of people who have type 1 diabetes now live almost completely normal lives. But in order to do that, it has to be diagnosed and treated. So type 2 diabetes mellitus is not an autoimmune disease. This is an acquired condition. It usually happens later in life. So another word for this is like an adult onset diabetes mellitus. And it is characterized, kind of the reason that this happens is that it is characterized by insulin resistance. So what that means is your body still produces insulin, but your cells stop responding to them. And why that happens is not completely understood. A lot of times it is tied to weight and diet, that if you consume excess amounts of sugars in your entire lifetime, at some point in your 40s and 50s, your insulin receptors just get sick of it and they stop responding because the levels have been so high for such a long time that they basically stop responding. There's also seems to be genetic components. There are some people that are just insulin resistant, no matter what their diet. It's the same reason. There's a lot of research on this now, especially with the uptick in like GLP-1s. So GLP-1s, Ozempic and Mounjaro and all that fun stuff, one of the ways that they work is they decrease insulin resistance. And so insulin resistance, I know type 2 diabetes gets a really bad rap, and there's a lot of shame associated with it because it is seen as something that you can control. That if you get type 2 diabetes, it's completely your fault. It's because you ate terribly your entire life. It's because you're fat. It's because of all of these other things. And that's not always true. Some people are genetically predisposed to having insulin resistance, which makes them genetically predisposed to holding more weight on their bodies, right? It's a complex issue. And one of the things that Mounjaro and Ozempic and things like that fix is insulin resistance. So we'll see as we go through, but Ozempic and things like that was originally created as a medicine for type 2 diabetes. That was its original purpose. It also happens to, as a side effect, cause weight loss, which is what's made it really popular. But type 2 diabetes is a huge problem in our world, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Probably has to do with a lot of our food choices, and poverty plays a big role in it, and genetics, all kinds of things, right? It's a very complicated thing. But type 2 diabetes accounts for 90 to 95% of total diabetes cases. It is the most common and generally the milder form of diabetes. Most people with type 2 diabetes can live relatively normal lives without having to inject insulin all the time. So fewer insulin receptors present or receptors that no longer bind insulin. So your body still has insulin. Your cells just don't respond to it as well. So it is not immune mediated. There is a strong genetic predisposition. Type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance tend to pass along in families, regardless of diet or exercise regimens. And it often has a gradual onset. This is something that can tend to happen really slowly. So over years, I know most of you are pretty young and you probably don't get, especially in college, I remember I never did it, but like getting yearly checkups becomes less of a thing until you get insurance when you're 25 and things start to go downhill when you're 30 or 35 anyway. But when you get checked every year, that kind of has like a gradual onset. One year your doctor will say, oh, your blood sugar is a little high, but it's mostly fine. Your blood sugar is kind of hitting closer to 100 all the time. That's not that great, but it's fine for now. And then the next year you go in, it's like, nope, your blood sugar levels are too high. It's a very gradual onset. And it is not insulin dependent because your body still produces insulin. So if you injected insulin, it wouldn't matter. Your cells are still resistant to it. Okay, your body has insulin. It just doesn't respond to it. That's the difference. And it's not ketosis prone, again, because the ketoacidosis comes from this absolute lack of insulin and the overproduction of glucagon. If you have insulin, like in diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you're not going to overproduce glucagon because your body has insulin. Okay, so it's not insulin dependent, not typically ketosis prone. Again, there are always exceptions. as the most common and generally the most mild. People who have type 2 diabetes, usually their diabetes can be controlled with diet, and nowadays things like Ozempic and Mounjaro decrease insulin resistance and actually kind of treat it. They don't quite cure it yet, but maybe they will soon. Those are all very new drugs, so I don't have a lot of research or talking points on them, but it'll be really interesting to see in the next few years or so how the scope of human health, especially in the United States. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is a huge problem within the United States, particularly. It is in other countries too, but the United States specifically. So it'll be really interesting to see how those drugs change kind of the landscape of the United States human health over the next 5 or 10 years. Right? So does the difference there make sense? In one of them, you don't have insulin at all, and in this one, you have insulin, you're just not responding to it as fast or as well. You're resistant to those insulins. Okay. All right, and this is just a risk factor box. This is what's in your textbook, and this is just showing the risk factors for type 2 diabetes. There is a strong genetic component, and there are a lot of things that can kind of indicate a higher risk for type 2 diabetes. Family history is one of the biggest ones. Having a family history of diabetes makes it very, very likely that you will get diabetes in the future. And then some things that are, controllable, I guess, habitual physical inactivity. If you're not exercising, if you're not eating right, if you're overweight, over the age of 45. Because there is a strong genetic component, there is also a large race/ethnicity component. Hispanic, Native American, African American, Pacific Islander communities are at a much higher risk. They are, can't think of the word, but disproportionately, that's what I was looking for, at risk for type 2 diabetes because it's genetic. It runs in populations and in families. Okay, history of, if you have, we're going to talk about gestational diabetes in a second, that's what it is. If you have a history of gestational diabetes, you are more at risk for developing type 2 diabetes, or if you have a baby weighing more than 9 pounds, cholesterol, polycystic ovarian syndrome, all kinds of different stuff. And you don't necessarily have to know all of these. Just know that there is a strong genetic component and there are a list of risk factors associated with type 2 diabetes. Yeah?
Can type 1 be genetic, or is that just...
Not usually. So that's one of those things that people don't really know. I've heard that it's not typically, but maybe. I don't know. A genetic component. There may be because it's something that you're born with. And there are people who seem to be more at risk for autoimmune diseases. And if you're more at risk, so people who have type 1 diabetes are actually also more likely to have things like Crohn's disease, which is also an autoimmune disease, or lupus, which is just the genetic pile of garbage. You get type 1 diabetes, and then you get lupus, and then you get irritable bowel disease or whatever else. But it doesn't typically seem to run in families. If you're a parent who has type 1 diabetes, it doesn't seem like you're more likely to have a child. Did somebody say something? Sorry. So there seems to be a DNA component, it's something that you're born with, but there doesn't seem to be a single gene that you pass on. Yeah.
So is it possibly a mix of mutations? Because I know a lot of autoimmune diseases are caused by stress in prenatal development.
Yeah,
So
it could be. And it is one of those things, type 1 diabetes, and a lot of these autoimmune diseases that don't have, cystic fibrosis is an autoimmune disease, or it's a genetic disease that it's this gene causes this thing. And if you have this gene, you are going to pass it on to your child. Huntington's disease is like that, right? But type 1 diabetes is something that seems to have a DNA component, that it's determined by your genetics, but there's not a single thing. There's all kinds of things now that talk about, I think it's just an article that said, did I go to sleep? not supported. Okay. That I think I read something recently that related type 1 diabetes and other autoimmune diseases to the health of your microbiome in your gut, right? All kinds of different stuff. So it's really hard to say, but the possibilities are endless. Like, it could be due to stress. It could be due to something the mother was exposed to during pregnancy. Who knows? Yeah.
I'm curious, what's the link between polycystic ovarian syndrome and type 2 diabetes? Why are they related?
I honestly have no idea. I would say that it has something to do with hormone production because,
Yeah.
again, ovaries are major hormone producers. They produce estrogen, and estrogen is very, very linked to insulin and all of these things. And so I imagine that it has something to do with hormone production because polycystic ovarian syndrome, the hormone production is out of whack.
Okay.
Sometimes you produce too much, sometimes you produce too little. It's really crazy. So I imagine it has something to do with that, but I don't really know specifically. All right. So our next one is we have these both on the same slides, our gestational diabetes and secondary diabetes. Now, gestational diabetes is associated with pregnancy when you are gestating. It occurs in 1 to 5% of pregnancies due to metabolic and hormonal changes. Again, hormones are wild. When you have a hormonal disease, something that affects your hormones, I'll talk about this a lot. You guys have probably heard me talk about it before if you've taken my classes, but I have hypothyroidism. I don't produce enough thyroid hormone. We'll talk about what that means later. But thyroid hormones, just the change in that one hormone screws up more things than you could possibly imagine. It messes with, like, I lost all my hair started to fall out. I'm freezing all the time. I had problems with menstruation and all kinds of stuff, just across the board. So when hormones get screwed up, everything is affected. So in pregnancy, sometimes those hormone fluctuations can cause diabetes, right? And pregnancy is one of the craziest times in a person's life because the hormone changes happen so fast and they're so distinct. They happen so quickly. That's why morning sickness happens. They call it morning sickness, but just the sheer amount of hormones being injected into your body makes you physically sick because your hormones are being changed so quickly. And there's all kinds of things that happen during pregnancy. It can make your nose get bigger. It makes your feet get bigger. All kinds of crazy stuff. Sometimes it causes gestational diabetes. And it's usually diagnosed during regular screenings for blood glucose levels. So I don't know if any of you have ever been pregnant before or had a partner who was pregnant or anything like that. But when you are pregnant and you go to I will say like a standard OBGYN, some more like, I don't know the word for it, like less typical, we'll say that, less typical caregivers, some midwives, not all of them, but like some midwives and more like homeopathic doctors won't do this test. But if you go to like a typical OBGYN during a pregnancy, at about 30 weeks pregnant, you will get tested for blood glucose levels. They make you chug this awful sugary drink, and they measure that they know has like 100 grams of glucose in it, and then they measure your blood glucose levels over 2 or 3 hours to see how your body responds to that glucose. Because right after you drink it, your blood levels are gonna spike, but if you're responding normally, if you're producing and responding to insulin the way you should be, the levels should drop back down to normal within an hour or two. If they don't, then you have a problem. So most of the time, glucose levels return to normal after delivery. So the biggest cure and treatment for gestational diabetes is having a baby. A lot of times, once the placenta and the hormones go back to normal after the baby is born, the glucose levels return to normal. However, people who have gestational diabetes are 30 to 60% more likely to develop type 2 diabetes later in life. So not associated with pregnancy.
Do you know why specifically? Just because the insulin receptors were released?
Yeah, so I would assume that it again has to do with a genetic predisposition to having insulin receptors that are more likely to become resistant. And all of that is related to people who again, some people just carry more weight on their bodies and they tend to be more insulin resistant throughout their whole lives. And it's just one of those things that if when you are pregnant, your insulin receptors kind of crap out on you because you're pregnant, as you age, it's more likely that that is also going to happen. And then secondary to diabetes are just other types of diabetes secondary to other conditions. So when we say secondary, we mean that the diabetes is happening because of something else in the body. Okay? And you don't have to know all these. You don't have to memorize these. You just have to remember that secondary diabetes is secondary to other conditions. And again, a lot of these are related to either diseases of the pancreas, which should make sense. So things like cystic fibrosis and pancreatic cancer affect the cells of the pancreas. If the cells of your pancreas are affected, your insulin production is going to be affected because your pancreas produces your insulin. Or endocrinopathies. Endocrinopathies are hormone disorders. So things like acromegaly, hyperthyroidism, pheochromocytoma. We're going to talk about all of those. I know you don't know what those words mean right now, but you will. But those are all issues with hormone function. Again, you screw up one hormone, you screw up a lot of the other ones too. Drugs or chemicals, things like thyroid hormones. So taking thyroid hormones makes you more likely to develop diabetes. Dilantin is a heart drug. And then certain types of genetic syndromes like Down syndromes and Huntington's disease can also put you at higher risk for developing diabetes. Because, again, human body is not just with hormones, but I think one of the coolest things about clinical chemistry and one of the coolest things that you kind of comes out of taking a class like this is you realize how much of a miracle it is that most of the times our bodies do exactly what they're supposed to. Because so many things have to be exactly right for it to happen. And if you topple one little thing, so many other things go down with it. And so the sheer number of us that spend most of our lives without diseases or chronic diseases, it's honestly a miracle. It's amazing when you think about a typically functioning human body and all of the things that have to happen to make that happen. Just for you to wake up in the morning is incredible. And it also makes it, I'm someone who, I don't consider it a chronic disease, but I do have a hormone disorder. And it's something that I have to deal with forever. It makes it make more sense, I guess. It's like all of the things that you deal with all the time. It's like, well, of course it is, because I screwed up this one thing. So everything, it just makes more sense. There's so many chances for things to go wrong. I don't know, makes it feel less lonely, I guess. I don't know if anybody else can relate to that, but it's just like, of course something's screwed up. There's too many things that have to go right for it to not be screwed up. So it just makes more sense to me. But that's kind of a personal thing, but. All right, so complications of diabetes. So any of the types of diabetes listed can have some of these similar complications. Again, diabetic ketoacidosis is mostly associated with type 1, but all of these are related to diabetes. So, and the reason that these are all kind of related, because these are really weird symptoms to all be related. Things like brain damage, kidney damage, heart attacks, blindness. Those are all related because high glucose levels over time, that high level of glucose is going to damage your blood vessels over time. Your body is not meant to have high levels of glucose for years and years and years. And all of that glucose will eventually damage your blood vessels. And you will have eventually decreased blood flow to peripheral vessels. So peripheral means farthest away from your central nervous system. So your central nervous system is your spine and your brain. That's the middle. Peripheral is away from the middle. Okay? And the further away your blood vessels are, the more likely they are to get damaged. Because these peripheral blood vessels, the ones further away from the spine, are smaller and they're more delicate. I don't know how to spell delicate, apparently. Delicate? I think that's right. Smaller and more delicate. They're tiny. The farther you get away from your central nervous system and your central blood vessels, the smaller your blood vessels are. Think about the tiny, tiny, tiny blood vessels in your eyeball. You can look at them. They're so tiny, right? Those little tiny red lines, those are blood vessels. Compare that to the size of your aorta. Most of your aortas are like this big around. Okay, that's the little tiny blood vessel in your eye is smaller and more delicate than your whole aorta, right? So the farther you get away from the center of the body, the more delicate and smaller those are. So those peripheral blood vessels, the smallest ones, are usually the first ones to go. So things like diabetic foot infections. The diabetic foot infection is a really common first symptom that people with chronic diabetes have because those blood vessels are so far away from your heart. You have decreased blood flow to those peripheral arteries, and they're damaged. And so if you have decreased blood flow to any area, that is going to create an increase for infections. The blindness, again, the blindness and the kidney damage are, again, because those blood vessels are so tiny. The blood vessels in your eye and the blood vessels in your kidneys are small and delicate, and they're easily damaged. So kidney damage, blindness, and then also because with any form of diabetes, you're going to have abnormalities in fat metabolism, okay? Because when your body does not respond the way that it should to the glucose in your blood, it is going to turn to other things for food sources. And one of the things that it turns to is fat. And so there's abnormalities in fat metabolism, can lead to increased lipids in the blood. And we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to the lipids chapter, but I just wanted to touch on it here. That it can also lead to high blood pressure and build up arteriosclerosis, which is buildup of fats and other things in the blood vessels. So high blood pressure is going to increase the problem of blood vessel damage. High blood pressure, right? Think about if you have, I don't know why I'm trying to think of something. Like, blood pressure is how much pressure there is inside your bloodstream. Think about if you have like a really delicate, I don't know why I can't think of anything, but if you had like a really delicate, like, if I was blowing through, like, if I had like a big plastic straw, okay? I don't know why this is all I can think of. I had like a big plastic straw and I blow air through it. If it's a big plastic straw, I can blow kind of hard, right? Blow hard and the air is going to go through it and the straw is going to be fine. But think about if I had like a piece of tissue paper and I'm holding it in front of my face, I can blow on it really lightly and it's going to be fine. But if I start like blowing winds at it and you put it in front of a fan, too much pressure, eventually it's going to break. And it's kind of the same thing with those delicate little blood vessels. You increase the blood pressure and those blood vessels get shredded. And so the high blood pressure leads to more blood cell damage, and the arteriosclerosis leads to more decreased blood flow. Because if you have a buildup of fats and calcium and plaques inside your arteries, blood's not going to be able to get through as easily. So the abnormalities in fat metabolism kind of compound the problems due to the high blood glucose levels. They're all tied together. Right? All right, so these are the criteria for the diagnosis of diabetes mellitus. We're going to talk about A1C probably next time when we talk about testing. But A1C is a measure of blood glucose. Again, we'll talk about it later. But when your A1C is too high, or a fasting plasma glucose, so that's fasting. Again, we'll talk about the definition of what fasting is next time. But a fasting plasma glucose of greater than 126, or your 2-hour post-meal glucose. So if you've eaten and 2 hours later, your blood glucose is still over 200, or a patient with classic symptoms of hyperglycemia or a hyperglycemic crisis, and a random plasma glucose of over 200. So if I go into the doctor and it's a random glucose. I've eaten at some point during the day. I'm not fasting, but I have a lot of the symptoms of hyperglycemia. My BMI is high, my blood pressure is high, a lot of those symptoms associated with diabetes, and my random plasma glucose is over 200, that can also be diagnostic. Okay. So these are the numbers that you are going to have to, I can't remember if I had them like in a chart somewhere. I guess not here. But these are the numbers that you are going to have to remember for the diagnosis of prediabetes and diabetes. So if we're talking about fasting plasma glucose, remember fasting means no caloric intake. And that's usually defined as about 8 hours. So you haven't eaten in 8 hours, you're fasting. If you're in a person who is typical, normal, your fasting plasma glucose should be less than 100. Usually, again, somewhere between 70 and 100. But a fasting plasma glucose less than 100 is considered normal, typical. Prediabetes or impaired fasting glucose is a fasting plasma glucose between 100 and 125. Okay? So if you go in and your fasting plasma glucose is 115, a lot of times your doctor will say your blood glucose metabolism is altered, you're pre-diabetic, this is your time to change your diet, things like that, and hopefully that'll help reverse it. But you will be diagnosed with diabetes if your fasting plasma glucose is over 126. Okay, and you do have to remember that number in specific. Okay, and then these are also diagnostic criteria that are based on what we call postprandial or post-load glucose. And this is what is normally used like during pregnancy, because asking a pregnant woman to fast for 8 hours is basically torture. But 2 hours, so this is what is typically used to diagnose gestational diabetes. It can also be used for type 1 or type 2. But if you, in a typical person or a normal person, 2 hours of post-load glucose, so 2 hours after you consume a bunch of food, your glucose should be less than 140. Okay. Prediabetes or impaired glucose tolerance, your 2 hour post-load glucose levels will be between 140 and 199. And diabetes mellitus, that 2 hour post-load glucose is over 200. However, this result it's mostly diagnostic, but it does have to be confirmed with this. So if a person comes in and they have this provisional diabetes mellitus, they do the 2 hour post-load glucose test and their result is over 200 milligrams per deciliter, they will follow that up and confirm it with a fasting plasma glucose. Okay. So the big diagnostic criteria, like in general, this is the one that's used the most to diagnose diabetes mellitus, is going to be the fasting plasma glucose of greater than 126 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, and you do have to remember that. All right, everybody good?